Well, our next special guest on Unpluggered is one of the most famous St Kilda supporters, a club historian, and the man you turn to if you want to know anything about the history of the club, but also for views on where we're at currently in 2021 as we look to build on the success of last season. I speak of Russell Holmesby, author of many a fine St Kilda book. We've given a couple away as part of prizes on this very podcast over the last couple of years. But Russell, nice to have you with us as we have a little bit more of a normal look at a football season after all of the trials and tribulations of 2020.
Thanks, Darren. So it's good to be back at the footy again, isn't it? Just you don't realise, well, you do realise how much you missed it, but when you get back there, you think, gee, that was just a lost year last year, wasn't it?
It certainly was a lost year. Russell, how long have you been supporting St Kilda, and what's your first memory of the Saints?
I first went to a St Kilda game in 1960, and it was early 1960, so I was 6 years old. I had just turned 6, as I figured out later, but I didn't sort of know what day it was special or anything, but it was the first actual Anzac Day game. There was two Anzac Day games that day, and that was the first time they'd played VFL games on Anzac Day. I found that out later, obviously, but I remember, and I've got a very clear memory of the day of one thing. I've got no memory at all of the football, but we got there and we were walking up into the Junction Oval, and we saw this bloke standing there, and my dad said, look, this is a very important man. Remember him, because he's really important. And he was wearing a light blue tracksuit, and still remember that. And I got him to sign my footy record. And it was Herb Elliott, who a couple of months later, of course, won gold in Rome. And I've still got that footy record, but you wouldn't believe it, I haven't got the middle pages with Herb's autograph on it. And many years later, I got to know Herb. He was the CEO at Puma, and I had a fair bit to do with Puma. I was working for Leader newspapers, and Puma was a local company. And I got to know Herb, but I met Herb at a first time at a St Kilda President's Lunch. This is about, I'll be mid-80s, and I told him the story. I said, look, I've still got the footy record. I haven't got your signature, so I'll fix that up now. And he signed my footy record from 1985 or 86, whatever it was. So and I got to know him quite well in the end, because we did a lot of promotional stuff with the local newspaper and with Herb, with a great man. And another guy who was there with Herbie was a guy named John Forbes, who you may have read passed away a couple of weeks ago. And Forbesy was the national marketing manager for Puma, and a great man, and who so many football people and all sports people knew him. And one of those guys who, someone said, I think it's a Paul Trimboli quote, that he was the most famous, unfamous person of all, because everyone knew him. And Forbes was a great man. And and that was my first experience of the footy. I probably went to a few games in 1960, in that first year as a kid, and then 61 I went most of the games during the year, and saw St Kilda make the finals in 61. First time in 22 years it was, and I remember my dad saying to me, he said, you're lucky. He said, your first full year going to the games and that, and you're seeing him in a final straight away. And because my dad had been barracking for him since 1928, and he'd only seen him in 1929 and 1939 make the finals. So twice in, 33 years.
Now, obviously you're very heavily involved with print media and a bit of other media on the side as well, but where did you start with all the media, and was it always sport and football you were looking to go towards, or do you just sort of naturally moved into that direction?
Oh, look, I always wanted I always liked to write, and I enjoyed writing, and always had ideas of getting into the media as a journalist. I didn't pass my year 12. We had a very good social year, but I did well in English, which you'd expect, but that was all you had to do, be able to write and read books. But like many blokes of my era, and that went into the public service with it wasn't Telecom then, it was Australia Post, PMG, and I was there for 14 years. But along the way, I wrote a bit for the local paper. I wrote a column called In Black and White and Red, which was a bit of a steal from Keith Dunstan's In Black and White. And it was my boss used to say it was creative bias, he called it. And St Kilda fans local in Moorabbin, as you know, Darren, there's a lot of St Kilda fans, and the St Kilda fans loved it, but oh god, some of the other barraggers for other clubs just absolutely hated it because it was so biased. And anyway, one thing led to another. Telstra, as it became, they decided to cut back on things and offered redundancies to everyone who wanted redundancies. And it was a voluntary one, you could take it. And I thought, well, why not? I was sort of writing. I was writing for a magazine called Footy Week in 1987, and so I spoke to them, and they were going to put on another journo, and the editor was going to put me on. And the day I was due to leave Telstra, he rang me back and he said, "Oh, I got some bad news." He said, "They're closing down the magazine." He said, "And I've been sacked too." So that was it for me. But because I'd been writing for the local paper, I sort of had a bit of a chance there, and I rang up straight away there, and I was lucky enough that the sports editor there was just about to leave, and I got the job there. So went back to half the salary I was getting at Telstra, so I was on a pretty good whack. And anyway, we sort of took that path, and I loved it. I mean, I was lucky, and I was already writing, even when I was still in Telstra, I was writing a bit for the Sunday Press, and which Sunday Herald Sun eventually became, but with Scotty Palmer, and so I mean I was doing a fair bit of writing anyway, but it was just as a secondary sort of thing. But it was something I always wanted to get into, and I did. So it's not the normal career path to get into journalism, and probably you couldn't do it these days because you'd have to have your year 12 and all that sort of thing. But I was very lucky and got the breaks to get in, and I suppose, well, you don't stay there unless you do it properly. So I must have been doing it properly for a fair while. So from 87 up till a couple of years ago, what's that make it? Almost 30 years, or around about 30 years. I was working. I worked for Leader, and then I went to Inside Football. Bruce Eva was editor at that stage. I was deputy editor for 1 or 2 years. Beaver moved to radio, and I took over as editor from then for about 15 years. Yeah.
I was lucky enough to do work experience in year 10 with yourself and Bruce at Inside Football in 2001, which was a great experience. But going back, I guess, earlier, before it all started, doing the maths, St Kilda would have won the flag when you were about 12 or thereabouts. Yeah. What was that experience like as a kid? And did you learn to appreciate that more as you got older, as the years piled on and piled on and piled on, and we haven't won one since, that you started to get a grasp on how big that was?
I grasped how big it was. I mean, it was like I was 12 years old, as you say. So, I mean, 12 years old, you know what's going on. And I'd been going to the footy, as I say, since 1960 and regularly since 61. So I'd seen every game. I think I saw about 100 odd games in a row, and I got the flu in 67, the middle of 67. And I was desperate to go. It was a home game at Moorabbin. It was going to break my run of about, 5 or 6 years by then. It was 100 odd games. I know, I figured it out at the time. But no interstate games, of course, in those days, so you could go to every game. And anyway, Mum sort of virtually tied me down to stop me from going. And fortunately for the Saints, but unfortunately for me, it was mid-67. Saints, as you're probably aware of the Saints history, they struggled in hot and cold in 67, and they were playing a crucial game to sort of keep in the race for the finals against Geelong at Moorabbin. And anyway, St Kilda just came out and absolutely blitzed them. And of course, funnily enough, it wasn't one of the TV games. They'd only replay a couple of TV games in those days, so I never saw the game, but I listened to it all on the radio. And there's one thing that you may have seen, Darren, a picture I used in one of the books of Darryl Baldock got belted, and they've got the close-up of him having his eyes stitched up. I think you would have seen that picture, having his eyes stitched up in the box, in the interchange bench, so or reserve bench as it was then. So look, I mean, I didn't take it for granted in '66. I mean, you still thought that there'd be chances of other premierships, and I didn't. I mean, I went to the '65 grand final as a kid. I was 11. '66, obviously, I went to. I didn't go. I went to the grand final in '63. We had series tickets, but I didn't. The years that we didn't make the grand final, I thought, oh well, no, we'll be there again next year or whatever, but I couldn't. After a while, I couldn't be so picky and choosy because I went in '71, and which we could quite easily have won, but Bob Keddy turned it on, of course, that day. And then, of course, it was a long drought, and I got to understand what my father had been through in those big gaps between finals years when there was, 18 years between 73 and 91 when we didn't make the finals, and we really hit rock bottom in the mid, 80s and that. So I mean, look, Collingwood people say about losing grand finals. I mean, I've seen St Kilda win one, draw one, and lose 5 in my lifetime. So, yeah, but I think Eddie Maguire once said that the best feeling in footy is waking up on grand final day and knowing that that your side is in it and got a chance, And it is. It's a great. And but of course, the downside is afterwards, and when you lose them, that's the downside of it.
Do you have any memories, obviously, as a 12-year-old, of that 66 season and secondly of grand final day and kind of what that meant on the day?
Well, 66, I mean, as you guys have known, St Kilda started off really well, won first 8 games. And I remember on the morning of the 9th game, they used to have a sort of preview show on Channel 7, and Bob Davis was one of the, commentators on that, and he said they could go through the whole season undefeated, like this, Bobby. So and I remember him saying that, and of course we got done that day. It was an interesting year. I mean, there's a lot of memories out of it. I mean, I did, as you know, probably I did a book a couple of years ago on the 66 finals and that, and and talking to all the players, brought a lot of memories back too. But I suppose there's a few things that stand out. Obviously, winning those first 8 games, that was something. They had a bit of a slump in the mid-season, lost to Richmond and Collingwood, and it was very tight for places in the finals. I mean, we're right down to the last game. St Kilda could have missed out in the finals, and it was only. And one of the clearest memories I have of that is we used to have seats in the grandstand that day, and then I don't know whether I graduated or went downhill to be in the animal enclosure later on when I grew a bit older. But we were sitting in the grandstand. We had great seats in the old grandstand, right on the wing. And and the Daryl Baldock, you know the story. Daryl Baldock was injured the week before or 2 weeks before. Had a crook knee and shouldn't have really played that day, but they, just in case, the word went round, Baldock's in the side, he's going to be on the bench, And they certainly needed, it turned out, I mean, it was one of those last round games where Hawthorn had nothing to play for. They were about 8th or 9th. They weren't going to make the finals, but they just threw everything at St Kilda, and it was really looking dangerous. And the grandstand was there was a chant. I remember, "We want Baldock," like this. And Baldock came out and just started warming up just near the bench and that. And when he came on, the roar was unbelievable. And they reckon about you feel the grandstand shaking. I reckon I felt it that day. It really did. It virtually shook. And because he was a champion, as we all know. He came onto the field, and David Parkin's written about it and spoken about it because he was playing for Hawthorn. He still remembered it. And he said that it just changed the whole dimension of the game. Baldock came on, he kicked 2 or 3 goals, he gave a couple away, and just turned the game around. And of course, it's history now that if we had lost that game, we would have missed out in the finals. Richmond only lost about 5 games for the year, and Richmond 18. They won 13, lost 5, and still missed out on the final 4. So, of course, they came back and won it the next year. But we were that close to missing out in the finals. But that thing with Baldock, and that was a real standout memory of that year. That it was just a sensational day and a sensational turnaround. And I've never seen a bloke. It sort of affected the opposition. It really did. It just the presence that he had on it and came on. And I've talked to other blokes. Delicate Des Dixon, who you've probably heard of, was a famous Hawthorn man who was one of the roughest, wildest players under the sun. A terrific bloke to talk to. One of those white line fever blokes you talk to is a really good bloke. He played that day. It was actually his last game for Hawthorn. But he talked about it too, that, Baldock, that bloody day, Baldock came on, So that was sort of that, and into the finals. We had all three teams. We had reserves and under-19s both in the finals. They must have finished third or fourth, both of them, and they played the first semi. St Kilda didn't play the first semi; they were in the second semi. So I remember as a kid going along there in the morning about 9 o'clock, and my parents had tickets and that they were going to come later. But I went at 9 o'clock to start to watch the under-19s in the seconds. And I remember I was about the only person sitting in that bay when I got there. It was cold at first in the morning, and I'm sitting there watching the footy the whole day. So they had a couple of blokes from the under-19s and the reserves that sort of came through out of that. John Manzi was one, played 100-odd games. Johnny O'Donnell was a terrific player, had a pretty short career, but with injuries. But so that was the first week of the finals. Second week played Collingwood. Got a bad start to the game. Collingwood jumped us, but St Kilda came right back in that semi, and there was a crucial sort of free late in the game. But the bloke who killed us that day was Tubman in the second semi. Kicked 7 goals from a half-forward flank out of about 11. Was a pretty amazing effort in any game, but in those days it was lower scoring, and you didn't have individuals kicking big totals. So we lost, went into the preliminary final, and preliminary finals against Essendon. Essendon had the wood on us in those days, but Essendon was always sort of vulnerable, I reckon, in wet conditions. And it rained all day Friday, and I can remember thinking, and everyone thought, this will be good for St Kilda, and it was. And they came out, kicked very, very straight, won it pretty easy in the end. And they'd been a bit of a bogey team, beating us the year before in the grand final. And they'd been a bogey team, but St Kilda got over them. And then, of course, the grand final, we know what happened.
So you talk about speaking with a few players and that sort of thing. How have you found the change over the time you've been working? Do you find the players back in the day were a bit easier to talk to? They gave you a bit more, or how are they, the ones you talk to these days? How's the comparison?
Oh, look, well, they're very these days. Of course, they get media training, and and work for Inside Football. I'd interview blokes after the game and that, and they'd start off, and you could tell they'd been trained to the nth degree, and they'd said, "Oh yeah, well, it was a great team effort. It was this, and that." And you think, "Oh God, you've had 38 kicks and you've kicked 5 goals, and and you won't talk about yourself." So it's sort of, they are trained to the nth degree, but I've found a way around that in a way. When they started like that, and you think, I'm not going to get anything personal out of them after a game of that, but I found if you talk about one of their teammates and say, "Oh, well, what about so-and-so? It was a good game by you." "Oh, yeah, well, he's been working hard on his kicking and that, and it sort of paid off." And they'd sort of give you something. But so it's changed a fair bit. Media managers these days, I'm not involved anymore. I'm retired now, but I'm still doing things, but I'm not full-time into it. And you have media managers running around with notepads after the game, and you want to talk to the bloke who kicked 7 goals, and they say, "Oh no, he did something the other day, so we won't be talking tonight." And you see some of the media managers. I won't name any, but you see some of them, and you wonder whether they're just put there to be gatekeepers and block you, as media, rather than actually open up. And let them talk, which is ridiculous, but. That's the way it's gone these days, and it won't change back in a hurry. But there's good media managers and ordinary ones, and a couple of real ordinary ones I could think of. But I won't say. But it has changed in that sense. They are trained to the nth degree.
We could go through an hour or so of the clubs historically that have been good to deal with and bad to deal with, and the unnecessary difficulties that they do put up.
Well,
there's a lot of publications.
You've seen it yourself. You know what it's like, and it's sometimes it's just incredibly frustrating at times, because you think, like, is it gonna? And the other thing about it's eased a little bit, but the whole idea of not talking after your team's been beaten. You see basketballers in the States and that, and they talk all right after they've been beaten. You can. Your tongue still works. You can't just not communicate because you've been beaten. I find that pretty amateurish, really. Yeah.
that's the time you need to hear from them. I mean, they win a game, you know what they're going to say. It's after they lose a game that you probably want to get that input. You've had a lot of great publications over the journey, and looking at the football books I read from the early 90s, and I remember thinking it's one of the great titles, because a lot of people ask the question, why do you barrack for St Kilda? And that book sums it up as to the reasons and the sucker for punishment, but also that loyalty. And obviously the title, the point of it all, indicates that what we saw in 66 is effectively the point of it all. Can you sort of encapsulate, if someone said to you, why do we barrack for St Kilda? Why do we go through all of this sort of stuff? How would you summarise? Summarise that journey?
I guess there've been times when all of us have wondered that ourselves and think, oh my God, why am I putting myself through this? Incidentally, the point of it all, I can't claim credit for the title. That was by Sandy Breen. Sandy Breen, she's a great friend of Molly Meldrum. You probably know her, Darren, around the club and that. And she actually designed the cover of the point of it all and came up with the name. So it was a great name, and it's one that sticks in everyone's mind, I think, as a title for the book. The point of it, what is the point of it all? I don't know. I think we just stick to it no matter what. I mean, I'm always amused, and I wrote a book earlier this year on Fitzroy's last 20 years, and I said in the introduction to it that I remember Rowan Conley, who's a friend of mine. He's a good bloke, Rowan, but he's an Eston barracker, so what can you say? But he said to me once a few years back, in Eston going to enter a similar sort of low point now, but they'd lost about 5 or 6 games in a row early in the year, and only had one win on the board or something, And Rowan, we went in the rooms after a game, and Rowan, he comes up and he says, "Oh, gee, I know what you've gone through now." I said, "No, you don't, Rowan. We've won one premiership in my time. You've won about 4. You've got no idea, just losing a few games in a row. You haven't seen the club almost go to the wall. And like Rowan had lost 5 or 6 in a row, and he thought the world had caved in. So I mean, I don't think, I really don't think that people involved with other clubs, like some people have seen it obviously with Footscray, Fitzroy had happened, but I always remember I was writing the Saint magazine for years, and we were writing one in, it was the mid-80s, early 80s. David Perry was the president, and so we put a president's message on the front of it each time, and I went in and met him down at the social club. We're going to talk about what he wanted to do in that, and I was going to ghost it for him. And I think it might have been around about a tin rattle time anyway, that he said, I said, "How's it going, David? You had all the papers all there spread out." He said, "Oh, well," he said, "we don't make X amount of money in the next 3 weeks, we could fold this year." And he wasn't saying that to sort of put the wind up me, or wasn't saying it wasn't artificial, it was true. And that was how bad things were. And I don't think, until you confront that as a barracker for a club, you really don't, like, there's a possibility this club is not going to be here next year, not going to be here next month. And it was sort of about June or July anyway. They had the tin rattle and whatever. But, I just really don't. I think people very glibly say about various times about, they should cut back the Victorian teams, or they should send someone to Tasmania. I mean, they didn't mention us the other day. People are very glib about that, but they really don't know unless it's happened to their club and been really close to it, as, a few clubs have, North, I suppose, too. Even Richmond. I mean, Richmond, when Alan Bond was president, they almost folded. So I think people underestimate the effect that it would have. And with the Fitzroy thing, and I know you don't want to stray on the Fitzroy too much, but with the Fitzroy thing, in doing that book and speaking to people, there's Fitzroy barrackers who haven't been to a game of football since, or they've given up completely on the AFL and they just barrack for the local. There's a version of Fitzroy these days, but or they barrack for another local team, but they just have turned their back on league football. So, I think people underestimate that, and certainly the Fitzroy thing should have taught people that it damages the whole fabric of the game, not just the Fitzroy supporters, but it damages everyone's interest, and people get disillusioned with the game.
Is that your low point of supporting St Kilda, that kind of 80s period, the Save Our Saints, the tin rattling, the throwing the coins onto the blanket or the boundary line? Would that be your low point in supporting St Kilda, or is there another moment that sticks out as kind of the toughest part?
That would be the toughest part. That would be the worst that got. I remember actually, when they were having the tin rattle, and I was editor of the Saint magazine, and we're doing all those things, and I was down there. We were trying to, get everyone signed up as members, and that's pretty hard. Like, the best form of marketing of memberships is when you're winning, and if you're losing week after week, you can have the smartest marketing plan in the world, but it won't get anyone to sign up. And I remember I took a few days. I definitely took a few days off work and went down to help out because they were trying to chase up everyone. Like Saint magazine used to get mailed out at that stage, and the ones where they'd changed addresses, we'd get them back. So I'd be on the phone and trying to track people down, and and I was part of that sort of, with people just putting their shoulder to the wheel to help out and try and get the support up and get the money in, and so I mean that would be the lowest point in my time of barracking for the club. Yeah.
Now you're involved being involved with the Heritage Museum at the club, and a lot of people sort of think, there wouldn't be much down there, sort of thinking, well, there's not much for us to actually put in cabinets or things like that. But what are some of the things that you've, in the time, got your hands on found and gone, wow, how does this exist, or where has this come from, or anything with a real interesting story that you've found somewhere?
Well, I suppose the most things, Georgie Day runs, I'm the historian, and I've sort of got the knowledge of all of that, and I've obviously got a big collection of stuff here at home too, but Georgie Day runs the museum, maintains it, and does a great job. But I suppose a couple of years ago, and it hasn't been sort of widely publicised this, but you may have heard the story of the 1933, the medal that they got for all the players. They finished with 15 men, got belted around by North Melbourne, who were a really dirty team apparently in those days. And they gave medals to each of the players. And the shield, which we were under the opinion, in the point of it all, we wrote that, that shield that we've got now, the crest, was put on the Guernsey after that game. But we found out that it was round 5. It had already been introduced. It was already on. We found a picture of the team on the day, and they had the crest on. Anyway, a couple of years ago, so it was only all the players in that game, in 19, one on the bench, 18 plus 1, plus the coach got medals. And the club used to have one of the medals from one of the players, but that disappeared somewhere. And that was before Georgie took over the museum, so there wasn't as tight a control on things. And anyway, a couple of years ago, the coach's medal, Colin Dean, his medal came up at an auction, and this was one of those many years where St Kilda had announced a loss for the year and all that sort of thing, and it was dramatic and that. But anyway, it came up for auction, and I sort of help out the past players on the past players committee, and even I was the most football talentless person there. But anyway, we talked about it, and it had an estimate of about $4,000 on it, and the past players had a bit of dough in the bank, not heaps, but anyway, we talked about it and said, look, this is coming up, what do we do? And the club really couldn't. It wouldn't have been a good look after just announcing a huge loss that they'd spend this on a medal. Anyway, so I went along to the auction, and I rang up a couple of the other guys in the past players. I said, look, what are we going to do? We can't let this disappear or not be connected with the club. So anyway, Andrew Cross and Simon Moon, Russell Morris spoke to them, and they said, look, go to $5,000, we'll cover it. I got another strong Saints supporter, I won't say his name because he didn't want his wife to know about it. He said, look, if you get close, if it's close and you look like you can get it, he said, I'll throw in another 500 and whatever. Anyway, so it gets up and it goes up and up and up, and it's 3,000, 3,005, 4,000, 4 or 5. It's going up and up. I'm thinking, oh God, we're getting close to the mark here. Anyway, it got up to just under $5,000. I thought, and there was another bloke bidding. I found the phone, and I thought, maybe if I go to $5,000, that might be his limit, and we can sort of nut him out with it. And we did. We got it. So the past players, it's the past players' ownership of it. They have permanently loaned it to the club. And you would have seen, if you've been down to the museum, you'd see it's on display there and whatever. So that was a great get. The other part of that story is that, and this is one that hasn't sort of really been publicised, but Alan Richardson was coach at the time, and we set about getting it, and we put things on the website and all that sort of thing. And he said, I want to talk to you about that anyway. And I said, yeah. Anyway, it was late in the year. Anyway, he said, look, when we sat down at a meeting, he said, I want to do something for the current players based on that medal and on the values of the crest, as they call it. They want to do something based on those values of, the agreed sort of mission statement, I suppose, if you have for the year, that the players come up with. And he said, what I want to do is award one each week, get a reproduction, but the front of it will be the same as the original medal, but the back will be for each round, representing who represented the values most of the team. And so the players loved it. And we got them produced by a mob down at Frankston called Cashers, they do the Premiership Cup and all that sort of thing. Anyway, so we got it done, and I presented the first one. It was great, actually. I mean, they had the Tuesday review meeting after the first game 2 years ago, and Richo said, "Oh, can you come down and tell them the story about it, and you can present the first medal?" I thought, "Oh, geez, that's great. That's a really terrific." He said, I said, "What do you want me to do then when you start the meeting about and analysing the game?" He said, "Oh, no, you're part of the club. You can stay." So I sat there as part of the players' meeting, which was, for any fan, forget about being a journo or whatever, but it was a great buzz to do that. And they've awarded those medals ever since. Rats came on as coach. He liked the idea too. And they awarded those medals again last year. And it was a bit awkward because they'd have to get them engraved down here, and they'd post them up because they weren't in Melbourne, of course. And they're going to have a variation on that this year, but still based on the crest, and it's going to be a certificate they'll get each game of that. So Rats has got a really good understanding of history and the value of history, but that's something. Well, it hasn't been publicised, but I can say it now. But that was a great get to get that because there are only 19 of them out there, and to see it used by with the current players to make them feel that there's more to football club than just the 3 or 4 years or whatever the average is, 2.4 years or whatever, that they're part of something bigger. And that's what both Richo, who started, and Rats, who carried it on, and they both personally paid for the medals to be produced, which is pretty amazing.
It's a great footy story. I mean, for a lot of people probably wouldn't know it. Certainly a lot of neutrals wouldn't know the origin of all of that sort of stuff, which is wonderful. I guess last one from me, fast forwarding to modern times. Obviously, we came off a very promising 2020. We had a good win undermanned in round one in the wet against GWS. Had a disappointing game last week against a Melbourne side that looked all right, but we certainly appeared to be a bit flat. Tough fixture, winnable game, obviously, to come this week. What are your thoughts on where the group's at and your expectations on 2021?
Oh, look, I suppose there's always a bit of pessimism with St Kilda Americans, and you never take anything for granted. But what worried me, and sometimes you have years where you just have a cycle of injuries, and we had so many injuries, pre-season and whatever, Geary, Patton, Marshall, Jones, all of these blokes with injuries, and I just worried that that might be that cycle of a year that you just never get them all back on deck. You think, we'll have Marshall back in 2 or 3 weeks, but he doesn't come back, or then he comes back and then someone else goes down and so on. So that sort of worries me. Look, I think with everyone on deck and playing well, we could make the top four, and after that you just need things falling your own way. But maybe we're not up to the Richmond Geelong sort of standard right at the moment, but you'd certainly hope that we'd advance on what we were last year. So, but I think, obviously losing Ryder and Marshall, when you lose players from the same part of the field, that's when it really hits. I mean, I think it was probably Richard's last year. I think most of the back line were out for the majority of the season, and if you have injuries and that hit you in the one area, that's very hard to cover. You can bring some in to cover one bloke here and there and whatever, but not in the same part of the field. So, yeah, I mean, that's not a total, comprehensive answer, but that's where I think we're at the moment. We need to get those blokes back on deck. And certainly, I mean, Ryder with his tap work, makes a hell of a difference in the centre. And we've seen with the style of play so far this season, if you can get the ball out of the centre quickly, you're halfway there. But, and of course, the other night against Melbourne, we didn't. And, and Gawn sort of had his, had the upper hand and that. So, but I think that's crucial to us, getting Ryder and Marshall back.
Russell, there's a lot of conjecture and conversation amongst Saints fans and has been for decades about who is the greatest Saint of all time. And, you get 10 Saints fans in a room, you could potentially get 10 different answers. Is it Baldock, Stewart, Plugger, Harvey, Rewalt, etc.? Who's your greatest Saint as the official historian of the club? Who's your greatest Saint? And I guess given the current circumstances in the last 18 months and last week's Spud's game, where does Danny Frawley sit amongst the pantheon of Saints all-time legends?
Oh, look, I mean, and Spud, a great leader, and led the club, very well, and had that sort of cohesive effect on people that, who could get them together, and, and he was, always sort of up and getting them going, and, building them up and getting them up. So, a great sort of St Kilda person and a great leader. I suppose a leader is the strongest thing. He was a leader, and he didn't have co-captains or anything in those days. It was just straight out, you were the captain. I suppose the blokes that you said there, and I'd throw Lenny Hayes into that sort of mix as, Hayes, Rewalt, Harvey, Lockett, Baldock, Stewart. That's probably the six. I always think, and when we did Heroes with Halos, when I did that book, the night we launched that, people love ratings and whatever, and so I wasn't going to rate 1 to 100, but I rated 1 to 20, and I put Stewart as the best player, and I think it was a Baldock and Lockett were the next. I can remember what was that order, Lockett and Baldock, or Baldock and Lockett. I always put Stewart as the best. Stewart didn't have a flaw in his game. And he wasn't a big bloke, but not just because he wasn't a big bloke. He was a terrific mark, a great kick, as you would have seen on replays and that sort of thing. Courageous to the point of just absolutely total courageous. And I always put Stewie as the best St Kilda player. The night that we launched the book, Stewie came up to me and he said, Russell, he said, if ever I don't know if Darren, have you ever spoken to Stewie, have you ever met him? Or he looks very seriously at you, and he said, Russell, he said, you've given me a great honour here, but you're wrong. And okay, Stewie, that's typical Stewie. And he said, Darryl Baldock's the best St Kilda player. And Stewart absolutely idolised Baldock in Tasmania. Stewart was about 3 or 4 years, or 4 years probably younger, and he came up watching Baldock, and he idolised him. And he said, I'll put it this way. He said, Darryl Baldock was about the same height as me. He said, Darryl Baldock could play in the centre just as well as I could, but I could never play at centre half forward like he did. That was Stewie's rationale. And a fair enough comment, Baldock played as a 5'10" bloke in a very hard position at centre half forward. And you can't forget that in assessing him. But there were games where he was contained, But Stewie, when he was fit, Stewie would still get his 20-odd possessions, and he was just remarkably consistent at a really high level. I mean, the first Brownlow, I think he got injured in one game. It was 18-game seasons. There was one game made interstates I didn't have votes for. So there's 17 possible games. He only played 13 of them. He got injured in one and left the field in about the first quarter. And he still won enough Brownlow votes to win the medal. Amazing, and just a great player, a flawless player. Baldock, great player, magical player, but he did get contained in games by Ted Potter was one, Jeff Pryor for Essendon was another one. They sort of controlled, they could not every time, but they could rein him in. When a couple of years ago, you might remember that they asked me to sort of re-rate the top 20, and I said, well, look, it's been 1995 when we did the book. I said, look, can we make it 30 so we can extend it out and bring some blokes in and drop some there. Anyway, we did that, and when we put that up, one bloke, it was after 2010, and one bloke wrote in and he said, if the ball had bounced the right way twice in the 09 and 10 grand finals, Riewoldt would have been captain of 2 premiership sides. He won a record amount of 6 best and fairest. So you'd virtually have to put him number 1, and it's a pretty hard one to argue, isn't it? Although Rui, as we know, the kicking wasn't always perfect for goal, but a great player, a unique type of player, and a terrific player. So, yeah, I'd still stick with Stewie as the best. I reckon the top 3, Stewart, Lockett, Baldock, you could have you're not doing badly if you have either of them at number 1, are you? So, yeah, that's about it, I reckon. Yeah.
And last one for me, for all the Saints that have gone through and you've written something about, is there anything you've sort of gone, I wish I didn't write that, I've written them off too early, or something going, I wish I'd said this earlier, or anything that any calls that you went, okay, I wish I went the other way with on someone?
Oh, yeah, look, I can't think anything come to mind. I mean, even one now that I wasn't convinced at first because he was a top 10 pick, and I didn't think early in the piece he was doing enough, but I've changed my mind now, is Nick Caulfield. Nick Caulfield's early games in that first season were nothing to write home about, and I mean, the kids and that, but you think you want to see a bit more. But I've changed my mind on him. Although I see that Gerard Healy said the other week apparently that, he said he needs to do more. Well, he ran 5th in the best and fairest in the side that made the finals. It's not bad for a 20-year-old, but anyway, I don't know how many St Kilda games Gerard didn't see last year, but it was a pretty unusual thing to say, wasn't it, really? But yeah, so Nick Caulfield, I suppose, well, for me, the biggest one would be, as a kid, as a 9-year-old, everyone's got a Guernsey number that they wear, and I wore number 10 as a kid. Neil Roberts, captain, he was just star, and had the looks, the whole atmosphere. He had the whole thing going. Neil Roberts, and he's captain of the side. He was my favourite player. And anyway, the next year in '63, the start of the season, they used to have the last practice game would be an intra-club one. Didn't play other clubs in practice games in those days, but they had the probables versus the possibles, and in the St Kilda Guernsey side, there was a number 10 running around there in that practice match. And we were watching the practice match, and I'm thinking, as a 9-year-old with a deep insight to the game, I thought, I don't know about this bloke. I might get another number on me back, But the next week he came out, and he was Carl Dittrich, and he thrashed Barassi. Barassi was the number 1 player, not the most talented, but the leader, and he'd been in premiership after premiership with Melbourne. And Dittrich has run rings around him, and he's got the blonde hair, and he's taking the big marks, and he's doing everything. So I was wrong with that one, and I certainly kept number 10 as my favourite Guernsey, because from that moment, yeah, look, he was great. And the thing with Carl, and I suppose it's to a certain extent the same with Lockett, that he didn't accept that St Kilda was a struggling team at any stage, or he just stood up no matter what. And, all that stuff that people say about St Kilda, and, they're their second favourite team, when we made the finals, the grand finals and that, I don't think that. I don't agree with that. It may be my sceptical nature, but I think people at clubs like Essendon, Collingwood, Carlton think that St Kilda has their place in the pecking order, and it's down the bottom. I don't think they feel, oh, something's wrong here. St Kilda's up high, you know. And I know that sounds like a sort of negative attitude, but I believe that. I reckon that, you know, St Kilda, stay down, stay in your place, you know. Lockett and Dittrich never accepted that sort of philosophy. They just stood up and, they gave it back, you know, and probably crossed the line with a few things at times. But both of them, I remember actually when we launched the point of it all, we had some highlights of Dittrich up there on the screen. And Plugger was looking at it and said, geez, you got away with a bit in those days, didn't you? Like, yeah, Plugger obviously thinking you'd get suspended straight away. But, yeah, so, I mean, that whole attitude, they just never sort of knuckled under. And that's what we like as fans, isn't it? You know, when it comes down to it. That's what we like.
Yeah, and I was always one that was always offended by I get the sentiment behind it, but the everyone's second team mantra, I'm like, I'd much rather you hate us because we're a threat and all of that sort of stuff. Yeah. I don't like the pity that's attached to that sort of comment that you're everyone's second team. But yeah, hopefully it reaches a point where no one ever says that because we're winning too many flags. But Russell, thanks for stopping by and having a chat to us. We could have spoken to you about St Kilda history for 3 weeks, I'd say, but yeah, hopefully we can right the ship this week and continue to march on because it'd be nice to have a cluster of finals appearances.
Well, we have, look, we obviously, everyone knows St Kilda one flag. Yeah, they say that, you know, one flag. And we know, and we would have loved it to be more. But St Kilda has got an interesting history. Mm-hmm. It is an interesting history, and it's, I suppose it's resilience more than anything else that, you know, that comes through right across the board through the history. And, yeah, so, yeah, and you're right, you know, it'd be nice. I don't want everyone else to think we're their second favourite team. You know, I'd rather they hate us because we're winning premiership after premiership. I'll tell you one last thing, and I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but when I was a kid and 1961 started going all the time, and I told someone this story again the other day that Hawthorn had won a premiership at that stage, before 1961. And St Kilda obviously hadn't won one either. And Hawthorn was, you know, looking like they were sort of coming good, though, you know. Anyway, St Kilda played them early in the year at the Junction. At the Junction Oval, the toilets the public toilets were right behind the visitors' rooms. And I can remember, you know, when the girls had done it at half time, Dad took me in there. I can remember everyone was totally silent because the rooms, the visitors' rooms, you could hear the coach. And it was John Kennedy, and they were behind, and he just roared at them. And everyone in the toilet was just totally silent, listening to the Hawthorn coach going off his brain, you know. Okay, Hawthorn went on. We know they won the premiership that year, 61, their first premiership. So what are they up to now? 12, I think.
13, I think.
13, yeah. I mean, you know, you think the fork in the road. I mean, that was, yeah. And for the other clubs like the Essendons and the Carltons of the world and that, and say, oh, they're the power clubs and that. For me, during my lifetime, of my football lifetime, Hawthorn is just that far clear as being the most successful team. You know, how many premierships have the others won in that time? What, Carlton's won, 4, I suppose? Essendon 5, you know. No one's come near their 12. No one, you know. So they're the power side, not these blowhards that sort of carry on about them being the power side, because they're not the side that's been the dominant side in my lifetime. Yeah.
Spot on.
Yeah. Hope it's been interesting. So yeah,
absolutely. But yeah, hopefully in 50 years' time, people say the same thing about us. But Russell, thank you very much, and hopefully we'll see you at Marvel Stadium or the MCG soon.
No worries. Good on you, boys. Thanks for that. No worries.